Welcome back to Sika Strength, welcome back to Sika-san. First question today. I'm a longer legged lifter and I've never been too sure if I just overreach too far in training, don't sleep well enough, or have slower recovery. And then it says perhaps more relative fatigue from lifting. Do you have any examples or things to look out for as signpostings from there? Right, the first thing is when we're looking at the correct amount of training, stroke, or overreaching versus overtraining, that's a big gap. Like, training hard and pushing yourself hard is very, very different from like clinical overtraining. You really have to push it to bullshit levels before you get anywhere near actual overtraining. Most of the time, people aren't anywhere near that. They're just overreaching. They're probably overreaching to the point where they haven't quite accumulated enough volume or kind of earned the right to train quite that hard. They just go a bit beyond what they should be doing. But overtraining, where you're not able to sleep, you might have physical symptoms of nausea, you might have feelings of anxiety, you might have low mood, any of those things that come along with clinical overtraining, the kidney pressure, all of that are very, very serious, and they tend to hit you like a brick wall. Now, in this case, the main aspect of your question tends to be around the fact that you're a longer-legged or longer-limbed lifter. To be honest, I don't think that makes much of a difference at all in terms of overtraining. It's probably a bit more difficult for you to make progress in certain lifts. Obviously, if you have very short, stumpy arms, you will tend to have a higher ceiling on what your bench press will get to versus somebody who has very, very long orangutan arms. But in terms of general morphology, we really don't see a massive difference between limb lengths in terms of how much training people can handle. Where we do see differences, though, is we see differences in terms of the total amount of training people have done and the relative run-in or on-ramp onto the training programs. So in the first few weeks of training, we'll tend to have some quite high volume work. Generally speaking, that's where people will have the most issue with training. The first kind of month of a 4-month-long program will tend to be some of the hardest work because they might not necessarily have done the work capacity work they needed to actually start off the program. In this case, if it's constantly at a certain point in the program, whether it's the higher volume work, whether it's the higher intensity work, you should be taking note of that. You should be learning from it. You should probably be giving that a small bit more attention and taking away that training time from the other areas. So if you always struggle with high volume work and struggle to recover from it, then you shouldn't be spending a lot of time in the real high intensity pieces doing triples, doubles and singles. You should be really concentrating on that high volume work and building the work capacity in order to be able to run a training cycle effectively. How would you approach a lifter coming off gear? Physiological and psychologically, what does goal setting, progression, types of training, etc. look like?
So we always talk about having a small percentage of athletes on gear, whether that be strength training or playing sports, and this is something we've come across. And the first place you need to start is just managing expectations. I don't know how much you were taking, for how long, what kind of athletes you're doing, or what kind of training you're doing, but it doesn't particularly matter. What you do need to understand is that your performance is going to taper off. Now, it won't be a sharp drop off. We get sometimes this psychological fear from athletes when they're coming off gear, is that if they stop taking it the very next day, everything goes kaput. It's actually much more sinister. It's much more insidious. You just have to slow deterioration back to natty status over a period of time. And unfortunately, there's not a lot you can do with that scenario. Gear works. That's why people take gear. Gear works quite well for some people. Again, you can't make strawberry jam out of dog shit. It won't make you the most amazing athlete, but you, relative to you, are better on gear. Now, how much gear you take compared to how little and stuff is a time for a different conversation, but know that your performance is going to deteriorate. But in a weird way, it's worse because it's quite slow over time. So you'll have this, what we've seen is initial period of a couple of months where your performance will actually be relatively similar and it will drop off. Now, in some cases, it'll actually drop off lower than before you'd ever started gear. So your highest natty achievement might be higher than the lowest point you end up hitting in the next couple of months. Again, luckily, I suppose in this case, is that's not forever. It will come back, but there's this tapering off period. And I say this because you need to manage expectations. You need to understand that this is going to happen. You probably won't ever feel terrible. There won't be this absolutely awful point where you just wake up one day and you're a pile of mush. And if you train really hard in the right circumstances, etc., you can keep some of it or get close back to your natural potential that you'd hit before. But do note that maintaining performances from what you use on gear just won't happen. Next we want to be looking at is nutrition. What I'd be seeing here, what we kind of see from the consultants and doctors we know when they're working with athletes, is that they generally seem to pile in on anything that might support recovery, hormonal levels in the natural fashion. So we're looking at things here like micronutrients, minerals, appropriate macronutrients, sleep, all become incredibly important from the physiological point of view, from hormonally, but also psychological wellness. So you're looking at anything here that supports your return to a decent hormonal panel. What you do for your actual following your cycle, your post-cycle therapy is often referred to, is entirely up to you and your doctor if you work with someone. So you're looking at things there peripheral to that will support just healthy living, which is very, very important to return to a decent state faster and does seem to be quite important. And then you just need to wait it out. So when we're training, the actual training we do is kind of playing it by ear. You won't necessarily regress training massively. You won't change it hugely. It'll happen quite naturally. Ideally, you don't have a big period where you need to train for something. It takes a long time for it to return back to where you probably were naturally. This dip period does seem to happen for a reasonable period of time. It tapers off and then you hit this trough. So be ready for that or expect it if you are coming off and you're planning to stay off. Now, obviously, if you're in a period where you stop taking PEDs, you're off for 3 months, you might not notice anything or very little change. And then if you go back on PEDs and back to training on gear, then you probably won't see anything. But it's kind of around that 6 month beyond mark where you start being like, oh, fuck, I'm natty again. So that's kind of what you should be expecting. That's a big thing. Healthy living, big part of that, just recovering. That's again for the physiological and psychological wellness. And training then is just kind of wait and see what happens, see how much you lose, how fast you lose. You couldn't have any specific training recommendations in this period. You just need to see what happens.
For someone just looking for a big snatch and back squat, does training the clean and jerk provide a benefit, a carryover, general strength or health? Very simply put, no. You really don't need to be doing any clean and jerks if you just want the biggest snatch you can possibly get, particularly if you're going down the lines of a big back squat and a big snatch at the same time. Is there a lot of data out there on this? Absolutely not. Most people who have hit the biggest snatches and biggest clean and jerks in the world have hit them at very similar times because they've been international or competitive level weightlifters. But if you're in the very unique case where you want a big snatch and a big back squat, clean and jerk doesn't really add any benefit to you at all. What I would say is the clean and jerk will actually add a massive amount of fatigue to you that won't be in any way beneficial to the snatch. Is there things that will be beneficial? Absolutely. Number one, the back squat has to be going up all the time to give you the best power outputs possible for your snatch. Also, looking at more auxiliary and accessory style lifts. So this might be strict pressing, it might be snatch grip pressing behind the neck, it might be midline stability work, it might be abduction or adduction of the hip. Depending on where your relative deficits lie, there's a lot of other work that will be additive or generally helpful towards your snatch and towards your back squat, but certainly the clean and jerk wouldn't be in there. If I was to recommend a quick listing of them, the first thing I would look at obviously is the back squat, but when we go beyond that, then you're really looking for indications of where you're failing the snatch. So there's certain things that we fail a snatch and it's purely just a technical quirk or an error we're doing. Maybe we're smashing the bar with our hips too much, maybe we're pushing our knees forward as we pull the bar off the ground and it's looping out in front. In those cases, we won't have a specific exercise recommendation. But if we have somebody and they're getting crushed by the barbell in the catch position, certainly building a stronger overhead position would help there. Maybe we have somebody and they're getting a lot of hip shift or displacement of the hip as they're pulling the bar off the ground. We'd certainly be looking at unilateral work on the legs then to make sure they're well balanced and during the pull that barbell is as centered as possible from side to side. When we look at other lifts and people chasing big clean and jerks at the same time as big front squats or big back squats, certainly the snatch can be additive towards them. It's a highly skilled movement that's not incredibly heavily weighted, and so the snatch can tend to be quite additive into other areas of strength and conditioning work or weightlifting work. but the clean and jerk is just a bit too heavy and really doesn't add anything in for you. Finally then, in terms of health implications or generally helping your health, weightlifting doesn't help your health. Weightlifting as a sport is really not going to be something you'd ever have in someone's program as a general good tool for increasing their well-being and health across the board. Mostly we get people weightlifting because they want to go to a weightlifting competition. They're athletes doing a sport who need that explosive power in their S&C work, or we get people into weightlifting who just want a challenge and to do something different in the gym, but it really doesn't add anything for your health. Some general lifting of weights and strength work will be far more beneficial than a clean and jerk ever would be. High bar back squats are popping up all over powerlifting programs recently. Are they being added as a non-comp accessory or as a replacement for comp squat to accumulate volume with less fatigue? Also interested to hear your thoughts on the sudden uptick in high bar back squats in powerlifter programs, or were they always there?
So in regards to them always being there, they were certainly present somewhat in some powerlifters programs. Kind of what you would have seen is not really necessarily high bar squats, but what you would have seen was equipped powerlifters, people like Ed Cohn would have talked about not using the suit up until maybe 6, 7, 8 weeks before the competition, and then adding it in that last portion, but they wouldn't spend the whole year using suits. Sometimes in those scenarios, they would have just been squatting deeper and then only would have done their competition style squat before this period. Obviously, powerlifting just got a lot bigger, so one of the main reasons we're seeing a bit more high bar squatting is that some lifters just prefer the high bar squat. It's a very small percentage, and to be honest, if you're looking to move the squat, the heaviest squat you can manage, within the rules of the powerlifting community and federations, low bar squatting for pretty much the vast majority of people is going to be the move that lets you move the most weight. There's very few people out there like John Hack or Andrew Kyle, the guy squatting 320 kilos high bar. John Hack is obviously squatting 360 something. They're quite a small percentage. Some people will acknowledge that and say, look, I don't want to do low bar, I just prefer high bar. For some people, even though it might move the most weight, it might be incredibly painful and not worth it for their other lifts because they're in so much pain from the low bar squat. So that's probably one of the reasons. As far as using the high bar as an accessory, this is something we've done for years with powerlifters. It's something we've said for ages. Sometimes we get a bit of pushback on it, but the results speak for themselves when we use it with powerlifters. So as regards to other people's programs, I haven't really seen a lot of other people's programs from current coaches. I haven't really seen a whole lot of people talking about it. It might be present for sure, but from other powerlifting coaches, I haven't really seen it popping up a whole lot. I know we're huge fans of it. If you watched, say, the video we did with Jamie, where he squatted 330 kilos low bar, you push his high bar pretty far, up to 285 kilos. He probably would have done a 300 kilo plus squat, but obviously I couldn't let him do that. So I injured his back and his knee. No, that's a joke. But in regards to it being more prevalent, I haven't really noticed a major trend. I actually haven't seen a lot of other people talking about it, but it is highly effective. But in regards to powerlifters using it in competition, it's definitely getting more popular, which is great to see, as it just seems to be a personal preference and not just straight to that low bar.
You always talk about twice per week being nice for squatting. What's your preferred frequency for snatch or clean pulls? This is a really interesting question because it brings up the idea that we have to be doing pulls as you go through a weightlifting program. And to be honest with you, that's how a lot of weightlifting programs are written. Let's say they're written, the coach knows you're going to be training 5 times per week. They're going to have 2 back squat sessions in. They're going to have a front squat session. And you'll probably have pulls on the other sessions that are in there. Maybe you'll have pulls in on the back squat session as well. The pull should be used as a specific technical learning tool, or in very rare cases, a specific strength training tool. So where the athlete isn't able to repeat the motor pattern during the actual snatch or the actual clean itself, and we need to use a snatch pull or a snatch clean or snatch deadlift or clean deadlift, we use that to be able to emulate the perfect motor pattern, or to be able to emulate the perfect motor pattern while doing valuable volume to gain strength. Now, in the case of standard weightlifters who don't need to alter their pull mechanics, do they need to be doing snatch pulls and clean pulls in every single cycle? They probably don't. If they are doing them once per week is absolutely perfect. If somebody really needs a lot of them, 2 times per week for the snatch, maybe up to 3 times a week in the snatch if that lifter is training 6 times per week. But generally speaking, we want to be additive with the pulls rather than having pulls in there and then taking them out if we don't need them. We need to add pulls in if they're needed for technical learning or direct strength training, but we don't need to be putting them in there as a kind of steadfast that you have to have pulls in every session or you have to do pulls at least twice per week. Why do you think weightlifting technique has regressed on average in the modern era of weightlifting? The formula was figured out by the Soviets and refined by other countries later. Why are coaches trying to reinvent the wheel?
So this is kind of a dilution effect of the main countries who would have been pushing the best technical model. A lot of those would have been ex-Soviet countries. I think technical progress probably peaked across the average international lifter in the 90s. If you look at a lot of the World Championships, if you go back to 1993 World Championships, I think it was in Hungary, Weightlifting News Agent put it up, and the technical model there across pretty much all classes, across a load of those countries, is very, very consistent and a very high quality technique. What's probably happened is multiple factors. You've got this dilution effect of a older coach who would have been educated, probably academically, certainly in those Soviet countries, would have been educated in a scientific method of weightlifting, would have learned a particular style, a particular technical model, a somewhat more scientific model, probably would have fallen out of weightlifting, would have died, might have died in recent years, and then we would have had some assistant coaches, but they wouldn't have been, for example, educated formally from that coach. So what we would have seen a lot in recent years, and I've seen this with a lot of coaches, that they would have learned from a coach and learned lots of things from them, but they wouldn't have learned that direct technical model. They wouldn't have learned it in this kind of academic setting or in this educational setting, and as a result then it's kind of like Chinese whispers, where we're getting a little bit worse technique, a little bit less knowledge on some parts of that. And then you kind of have to look at modern day weightlifting. You know, a lot of countries that would have been formerly greats in weightlifting have had their ups and downs of weightlifting. They mightn't be as present anymore. And then we've lots of countries who formerly wouldn't have been huge weightlifting countries. Maybe if we look at the South Americans, you know, Venezuelans, Colombian weightlifters, even some of Mexicans, for example, America, North America, those teams are, just for example, I'm not saying Mexico's in South America, but those teams are kind of on the come up now. Even some Canadian lifters, and we've got some other countries who weren't always the biggest lifters are now coming forward, who didn't have a big history of a big technical model before, and they're presenting themselves. And even though they have good technique, it mightn't be as refined as the new circumstances. You know, if we look at Bulgarian weightlifting, they always had their particular style of technique, and it was developed through this style of training. And so when that style of training was dissolved, not used anymore, then we saw this technique change. Obviously, we saw the Bulgarian Weightlifting Federation being absolutely decimated. And now we've a couple of lifters, Carlos obviously being the main one. He's in quite an interesting circumstance. Even if we take, for example, Romania, you take Gabriel, one of the best technicians, one of the best weightlifters in history, just in terms of actual weights lifted at body weight. You know, he snatched 190 kilos, clean jerked 225 kilos at 88 kilo body weight. I asked him before, like, how did you learn technique? Like, who taught you when he was coming up in a juvenile system? You may remember a video where we were actually in his junior club. And when he was there at 12, 13, there was no spreadsheet on the wall. There was no angles. It was in the club. The coach would be saying, you're doing this wrong. Older lifter, so-and-so, 15 years old, he's 2 years old, and you look at what he's doing, see this part of your lift, then you go and do that. Now, I also know Gabriel, for example, thought about technique for himself a huge amount, and then he resulted in this technical model he has today after, you know, quite a long time. For example, if we look at Miso Asona, we were in Qatar, we very graciously spent a lot of time with them, and Miso's father talked about traveling to different countries, trying to learn weightlifting, and having a hard time actually learning anything of value. I won't say what countries they went to, but they went to a lot of the stands, and they found that a lot of the information that they got was pretty useless. This was in recent years, you know, in the last 10 years, it was very PD related, is the way they were phrasing it. They didn't really have a great technical model. Their training system was pretty rough, pretty intense on athletes. So we're getting this slow, just kind of dilution of knowledge and a loss of that knowledge. For example, one of the great Belarusian coaches died 4 or 5 years ago now. He would have been the stalwarts of that Belarusian program. He would have taught their very quintessential Belarusian technique. He died in his 70s, and so you're just not going to get this one-to-one transfer. And if we don't have a centralized system, then we're not going to learn it. And if all these countries have lost their centralized systems, we're just going to slowly get this kind of regression in technical models. So we're kind of in this situation we are now. And then also, these countries would have been the most doped countries, I suppose. So they've been punished or trying to be punished in recent years. So, for example, we've seen the Kazakhstan team come up and then gone again, and now they're back again. So we're getting this very tumultuous environment, doesn't provide for the best education system. So that's probably why. And then again, if we're looking at a huge amount of international lifters, if there's less of those, which there seems to be, and there's less of these going through the ringer, we're probably less likely to see just better athletes, as evidenced by, a lot of all-time world records not being set in recent years. Lou is probably, of the last generation of lifters, Liao Hui are probably two of the best lifters. Lash is three, in the last 25 years, 30 odd years, who've been really setting big numbers, and obviously they all have great technique as well. So it's definitely a combination of factors. It's quite interesting. Weightlifting's ever been more popular, but I think they're the large reasons that's why it is the way it is today.
Tips for maximizing training around an injury. I just dislocated my shoulder playing rugby. I'm restricted to lower body machines and unilateral work for the foreseeable. So firstly, very sorry to hear about your injury. The good news is during a shoulder injury like that, you can do a massive amount of training. Particularly if you're playing rugby, if you're in Northern Hemisphere, you're just kicking off your season now, or you might be a month or two into your season. There's a few things you can do, and there's a few things that will make a massive difference to the rest of your playing career, but particularly the rest of the season. The first thing is look at any large-scale changes you need to make and start making them now. So if you're somebody and you're 10 kilos overweight or you're 5 kilos underweight, just make that change immediately now. You've nothing else to do. You can't play on the field. You can't be involved in team sessions or anything like that. So go and do those large-scale morphological changes right now. Just gain the weight, lose the weight, gain the muscle, lose the fat, whatever it is, make that change right now when you have nothing else to do. The second thing is look at large deficits in your physical makeup. Do you have very weak legs? Do you have a very weak upper body? If it's a weak upper body, obviously you're somewhat restricted, but you should be absolutely blasting the other side as hard as you possibly can. Increasing those growth factors as much as you possibly can.
Jesus Christ.
If your left shoulder is goosed and you're in a full cast or sling, you should be single arm dumbbell benching and cheetah rowing 3 or 4 times a week as hard as possible. Your other arm should be absolutely destroyed, training it as hard as you possibly can. You're going to increase the ability of your injured side to heal up. You're also going to increase the likelihood of holding more lean tissue mass on that injured and restricted size just from training the non-injured side. The final thing I'd say is look at your rugby game, not in terms of your physical makeup, but look at your rugby game and figure out where your deficits lie. If you can't figure them out, I'm damn sure your coach will be able to tell you 2 or 3 things you need to work on. Maybe that might be catch and pass, in which case you're using that non-injured side. Single arm passing, single arm catching as much as you possibly can, increasing that hand-eye coordination as best you can. Maybe it's kicking, maybe it's contacts, whatever it is, you should be identifying those areas which you're pretty weak in right now, training them if you can train them. Maybe it's some sort of skill or reaction time thing, but if not, watching as much tape as you possibly can, figuring out all these different steps you need to be implementing once you're back on the field, once you're back able to train with the team, and then hopefully bringing that knowledge not only to improve your own game, but to improve the team's game overall. If one purely cares about weightlifting, is it worth taking time out of the year to run the RTA? I assume no, but the answer will be fun.
So the answer is actually it might be in the cases where you're not the best squatter if your ratios are much too close. So for example, if you're snatching 100 kilos and 160 kilo squat is hard for you, and more notably you're a very slow gainer on the squat, it might be worth getting a head start. And we've had this scenario with some lifters where pretty much similar to those numbers, we've taken a bit of time out, maybe 2 or 3 months, to get a big head start on your squat. So then when we get back to a main weightlifting block, then you've got this little bit of a runway where you can keep pushing your squat because you've got a bit of advancement in it, and then we get back to work in the snatch, clean and jerk. The important thing here is to understand which you are, how long you're doing it for, and also when we say taking time out to run the RTA squat program, it's not stopping snatching and clean and jerking altogether. We're still doing some snatch, clean and jerk. We're probably still doing some variation, and we're loading it appropriately, but our main focus then is on the squat and pushing it. You can do this if you want to, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it unless your squat is suffering or you know that you have a pretty good relationship between increasing your squat and increasing your total after. For example, if you're someone, if I add 20 kilos to my squat, I'm going to be in a great scenario to add in 5-10 extra kilos to both of my lifts. And so in that scenario, then it is worth taking some time out. But again, just think about it. Don't do too close competition. It can be worth it, but just be smart about it.
I've heard at lighter weights to keep maximum bar speed and change receiving position, so like catch it in a power snatch. And I've heard to always have the same speed under the bar and change the bar speed to succeed at each weight at the same receiving position. What are your thoughts? Let's just simplify this. One of these, he's pulling the bar as fast as he possibly can at every weight and then relatively catching that bar lower and lower as the weights increase, versus changing the speed you're pulling the bar at and catching the bar in the bottom or in the catching position correctly each time. The answer to this is it depends. And it really depends what stage you're at in weightlifting. If somebody is a super powerful junior lifter, they're absolutely smashing through weights, they don't need to be massively worried about not hitting the bottom position on every single catch. Probably will do them no harm if at 50, 60 and 70% they're powering one or two of their warm-ups and doing a full snatch on one or two of their warm-ups. That really won't make the difference. What does make the difference though is if you are at the point where you're really trying to learn the snatch, really trying to learn the clean, you should not be doing power snatches on the way up. So what I mean by that is you should be appropriately pulling on the barbell with enough speed where you're ensuring that you're getting underneath the barbell in the perfect position each time. So if you are in that case, you're in the first 3 or 4 years of weightlifting, you're very much on that beginner scale, you're very much trying to refine the movement of the snatch or the clean, you should not be ripping the barbell off the floor and being happy to catch it in a kind of shoddy power snatch each time. You really want to prioritize the correct positions. We always talk about positions, then movement between positions, then movement between positions with appropriate speed and power. If you're in the beginning phases, and you're really trying to refine your technique, you should be looking at positions firstly, then looking to add the speed in afterwards. So if you are, as I said, in those initial 3 or 4 years of training, you should be looking to catch in the perfect bottom position each time, appropriately pulling on the barbell with the correct amount of speed. The important thing really with the pull is that the barbell is accelerating. So it doesn't necessarily matter what the absolute speed of the barbell is once it leaves your hips. What really matters is the barbell is moving faster at your hip than it was at your knee, and the barbell is moving faster at your knee than it was when it's at mid-shin. Hi lads, would you recommend a hypertrophy block for weightlifting at certain points in the year? For example, can I just run weightlifting blocks indefinitely with deloads in between, or should I throw a couple of hypertrophy blocks in between? If hypertrophy blocks are needed, is there a plan to add something to the app? Eternal glory to Sika Stan.
So you've actually asked 2 questions here, and I'll answer the second one first. You're talking about, can you just run weightlifting blocks indefinitely? And this will help answer the first part of the question. And the answer is no, you definitely need a deload period, probably an extended deload period, where you realistically, if you're a non-full-time athlete, you just won't be able to get block after block after block of weightlifting done, even if our program is 4 days a week, without some kind of interruption, without some kind of probably pain or injury or training-related fatigue or outside stress. Something is probably going to pop up. So what we need to do here is just have a little bit more planned periods of downtime, where you're doing a little bit less weightlifting for an extended period. 3-4 weeks can work wonders, maybe even longer, where you're not stopping weightlifting by any means, but you're still doing some snatch, clean and jerk, you're still squatting, but you're just taking a little bit of a period where you're not pushing it as hard, because it's just not possible to push weightlifting that hard. Now in regards to the hypertrophy block, in weightlifting, you actually don't necessarily need to do a hypertrophy block. So if we talk about that in other sports, we'd be thinking, for a rugby player, we're not going playing rugby anymore. We're not throwing a ball. We'll do some skills, whatever, but we're not playing pitch games and a hypertrophy block in the off season. But in weightlifting, that means that hypertrophy block is less snatch and clean and jerk, but still a reasonable amount of snatch, clean and jerk. Still 1 full snatch per week. Still 1 full clean and jerk per week, but we're not really in this pushing phase. And then the hypertrophy work is higher volume squats, extra bodybuilding for etc. But we're not really in a weightlifting phase. You don't ever need to do a block where it's pure hypertrophy based training all the time with no Olympic lifting, no matter how skinny or how much you need to gain weight. Because the kind of beauty of weightlifting is that a lot of times you'll see, because weightlifting is somewhat of a low caloric consumption sport, weight training in general just isn't the highest calorie consumer. For example, if you compare to an hour on the bike, if you're sitting on the bike, zone 3, maybe zone 2 or zone 3, you're pushing it, you could be getting close to 800 to 1,000 calories done if you're pushing it a small bit. But 1,000 calories an hour of weightlifting isn't a whole lot. So we've got a lot of resources available that if we add in an extra bit of bodybuilding or hypertrophy work while we're weightlifting, we're going to see that and pay wonders. We get a little bit of extra calories, get a little bit of extra volume, we do more assistance work, we get more specific with our isolation work or add in extra volume or sets on that, then we can see hypertrophic gains. So you can actually add muscle quite well while weightlifting. Don't start your extra hypertrophy phase on week 10 of 12, but if you're starting week 1 of 12, you can start pushing that hypertrophy work. And answer to your third question, there is bodybuilding stuff. So there's one block so far of upper body armor on the app for weightlifting. Check it out. This feels like an ad, but it is. So it's actually literally there. So it's extra upper body work for anyone who wants to do extra upper body stuff. And if you're running the weightlifting program, you can add that in as your second program. So it's right there for you, upper body armor.
I used to follow a squat program back in the Clarence days. I was able to put on 10 kilos on my squat week in, week out, from 70 kilos to 160 kilos. There was no break in the program. On the lead up to the 160, I switched to 5x5 squatting every day. I am surprised that this didn't lead to overtraining. My question is, could this program have been the right thing for my body at the time, or would programming in periodization at that level have given me better results? And then it talks about the program. Definitely proper periodized training programs would give you better results. So when you look at going from 70 to 160, 9 weeks of training, those things aren't that crazy. Like, to start the training block at 70 kilos with your 1RM could have been 155, and we're really looking at training as the long-term progression. Just because something didn't break you in 2 months does not mean that it was the correct program for you to do. Also, doing a crazy amount of something and not getting broken doesn't mean it's the correct thing for you to do. There is an optimal solution here, and the optimal solution would be what everybody agrees on as kind of periodized squat training, how you would appropriately load that, going with voluminous work at the start with quite low intensity and then bringing that to higher intensity over the course of the training cycle. The other thing I would bring up here is, if this is back in the day, it sounds like 5 or 10 years ago, what's your squat looking like now? Nobody makes progress. We have multiple examples of people squatting every day and making no progress. It doesn't work. It's a terrible thing to do. As a kind of mental clarity exercise, it's a great thing to do. As a accountability piece, it's a great thing to do. But in terms of getting a better squat, it's probably the worst thing you could do besides just not squatting at all. So would you have made better progress? Yes. Should you do 5x5 every day? Absolutely not. And was it the right program for you back then just because you didn't break? Definitely not. Do you lads put much stock in numerical data for limb strength and lifting? Example, isokinetic knee extension, force plates, velocity meters. Or do you use these much? Context, we are encouraged to use them a lot in the rehab world, but they are often quite clunky and time consuming when I feel you can often get reasonable data out of the perceived relative effort or coordination of the movement. Example, knee extension, single leg vert, single leg squat, etc.
Yes, we love them, but no, we never use them. So it's a really interesting scenario of they're just not feasible, like you kind of suggested there. So you're in the rehab world, so you might be looking at maybe range of motion style protractors, the isometric force that we'd see a lot of the chiropractors using. In regards to those, in regards to the rehab world, I do think they're quite useful. Talk to a few people who I really respect on those. Largely comes down to, again, your interpretation of the data and how you're gathering the data. So, you'd see people online being like, that doesn't mean anything, you're just not pushing as much. And there might be cases where people do that, where they're saying, look how much stronger you are. I could very, very feasibly see someone doing that. But you as a patient will know how hard you're pushing. I've those tests done multiple times, and there's times where you just cannot adduct your shoulder where you just cannot go any further after a bit of treatment, and you see some change, which again comes into the neurological aspect of soft tissue work and rehab and stuff like that. But that's not the particular question here. Yes, in general, I do think they're great. Again, if you're gathering them in the context of the individual, and we're looking at the variability of that individual and putting a context on them, for example, velocity-based training as a programming style for strength training, completely useless if you're good at programming. But it is interesting if you have this on an individual who has 2 years of data. For example, let's say someone squatted 300 kilos and they had data on their sets of 5 at 240 kilos, and we had that speed, and we had 7, 8, 9, 10 different sessions, and then a year later you're squatting 240 kilos for 5s again, and you had more data. It would be interesting to see where that is. Would it influence your decisions? No, but might it give you more credence to the stuff you've done so far? Definitely. So force plates then, when you're rehabbing, definitely something interesting going on there. We do like the use of force plates, but they're wildly unfeasible to use with athletes. They're incredibly expensive, hard to set up, and just no one really has them in most cases. So if you're not in a university or in a research center, you're just not going to have access to those. So I love the idea of them, but we just don't ever use them.
How frequently would you add in upper back work for weightlifters? Due to the nature of the sport of weightlifting, upper back work is basically being done every day. If you're doing snatches, cleans, jerks, pulls from the ground, squats, anything like that, your upper back is being taxed. In terms of additional work being added in, at least twice per week. So you could say 50% of your training sessions should have direct upper back accessory work in there. That might look like single arm rows that are quite controlled, quite normal, nothing crazy in terms of our loading there. Real moderate load, kind of just bodybuilding stuff. You might also have a day a week where you're doing an ironing board row or a pendlay row and really going to town on the upper back and getting some quite heavy stuff done there. But definitely you could say for 50% of your training sessions, you're hitting your upper body and upper back particularly with some pretty aggressive hypertrophy work. Best lifts for discus throwers.
So we've dealt with quite a few throwers over the years, largely shot put and hammer throw, and a few discus throwers, but not as many. But they, to be honest, largely remain the same for the lifts we're looking at. So first place we're looking at is big squats, big deadlifts, probably some pretty big box squats at some points, depending on what kind of athlete we have and what kind of quality of squat we're getting. Then we're looking at potentially snatching. Something about discus throwing and snatching does lend itself to that opportunity. Again, if we can get that overhead mobility going, a good snatch. And usually if you've got a good discus thrower, they have that good capacity to learn a good quality snatch. You'll see them putting up decent numbers, whether that's a hang power snatch or a power snatch from the floor, maybe depending on how that's going. Then we're going to look at obviously power cleans and cleans. Hang clean pulls, block cleans are going to feature in there. Lots of upper back work for sure. The squatting, the deadlifting is going to take a big part of that kind of strength stuff we're looking for. And then we're going to be looking at decent range of motion, the shoulder rotational work, seeing how that's going with that lifter. They'll probably be aware of that anyway, but we're looking at those bigger movements. Then we're going to look at some single leg stuff. So probably Bulgarian barbell back squats will probably be quite useful. Might push those a little bit. And lots of hinging work then, so we're going to look at assistance work like RDLs. So again, it's going to be pretty the usual. Lots of core work, lots of our back work. The funny thing about this is you could apply this to any one of 5 sports, and the only thing that would probably change is the magnitude of those lifts and the power snatch or snatching. And even in some cases you can make those work. So best lifts for discus thrower, surprisingly the best lifts for a soccer player. It's just a magnitude of what you're doing. If you give me someone and we're trying to win the speed kayaking duo event at the Olympics, we're going to be doing a lot more direct arm work and upper body work and snazolol than a discus thrower, but the exercise we're using are going to be largely similar. But again, we're definitely looking at big Olympic lift, one of them, try and master one of them, try and get a big squat in there, preferably a full depth squat, fucking Daniel Stahl style, but that side of squat. If not, we're going to take below parallel box squats with some good weights, and then we're going to be looking at some other variations there.
How often to do mobility? This is every single day. If you have something you need to change, if you need to gain range of motion somewhere, do the mobility work every single day. It just makes it so much better. You'll get the results. We always hear people constantly, no matter what mobility thing is brought up, no matter what video I see of maybe someone great like Kelly Starrett or Squat University going through a mobility piece, they'll say, oh, I tried this and it didn't work for me. And that's because they probably tried it twice per week when they were doing their squats or something along those lines. With mobility work, most of the time you don't need to be in a gym. Most of the time you don't need gear or equipment to do it. You actually just need to sit down and do the mobility work. You should be doing it every single day. Ideally, for things like ankle mobility and stuff where you need to make big scale changes, doing it multiple times per day will be what gets you there. If I put a timeline on it, for those big muscle groups and those big changes, 4 to 6 months of doing that and you'll see a big change.
Isn't it weird that there's no drug for mobility? Well, actually, that's not true.
Yeah.
I've heard tell from Eastern European lifters that there is an injection they use to increase mobility in the joint, but there's a possibility of you just being outrageously mobile.
It's the same hormone that's released during pregnancy.
Yeah.
In the 3rd trimester. Speaking of which, what are natural limits?
So basically someone was asking, what are the natural limits in regard to like snatching and squatting for someone around the 90 kilo body weight? And the answer to this is, 1, we don't know, and 2, it doesn't matter. Now, I know you're asking this probably just in the case where you're wondering, but what a lot of times happens is people will ask this question to give themselves a point of reference to either make themselves feel better, and whether it be that they're actually stronger than they thought, or that they have no chance of being that good, or there's ways of putting perspective on this or seeing how good they are now. The main thing here is if you're looking for reassurance, don't put outside validation as your form of validating your achievements. All your achievements matter to you if you're improving to yourself, and that's the only thing that matters. In regards to what we could actually see here, I don't know. I've actually no good answer for you. I could give you general numbers, but the problem is one outlier doesn't make a spectrum. It really doesn't. It just kind of, it does make a spectrum in some ways, because if we have 98% of people over here, and then we have a few people here, and then we've got one fella over here, we've got Clarence Kennedy or fucking Blaine McConnell up here or something, it doesn't really give us a fair representation. That's what one person could do at one time, but for everyone else it's a completely meaningless thing. In fact, it's actually worse for you, because if you're in here, we're in the most of that bell curve, and there's a few guys down here, what good is it to you to know that, oh, you can actually squat 300 kilos natural at 85 kilo body weight? What does that matter for you if you have been training for 5 years and you can train and you can squat 160, for example? Another thing as well is that it doesn't matter whether it's natty or enhanced limits. By the nature of statistics, it's unlikely that you are the guy down here. It's unlikely that you are that Clarence Kennedy. I don't think we've met another Clarence Kennedy. Maybe Gabriel's a Clarence Kennedy as well.
I think he is, yeah.
We've had some freaks through the books over the years. We know someone, but they're like super tiny percentage. But you'll never know until you just train for 10 years anyway. So my answer to this question is always, if you're this body weight, train for 10 years, come back and tell me what you hit, and I'll write it down in my little notebook, and then I'll take note of it. For example, we were looking at numbers today on our back squat programs, and of the flipping thousands of people who've run the Road to Near squat programs, you've not 13% chance, well, I suppose you do, 13% of users have a greater than 180 squat, and this is a
shocking
big statistical pool. We were actually kind of surprised, because you obviously numbers creep up on you, and how you view statistics is where and when are you looking at it. And then we just looked at a lot of the data we had, and we were like, whoa, 13% of people are greater than 180. Not super exact, but that's a lot of people under 180 there. So it's an interesting question. We'll never know the answer. It's gone too far. We'll definitely never will know the answer in 2024. There's more drugs than ever. Woo!
I just since last week's Q&A, I've been mulling this over in my head and chewing on it a small bit. The difference between you and the next person is vastly greater than the difference between you on drugs and you off drugs. So the difference between you as a standard run-of-the-mill person versus somebody who's just one standard deviation away from the mean, they can be so much better than you ever will be, natty or non-natty, just by barely training and taking no drugs at all. You could rail things as hard as you possibly can, and you might barely snatch 110 kilos, when there are people who will go to the gym, and literally we've seen one of them a few years ago, came to the gym and on his 2nd or 3rd week of weightlifting snatched 100 kilos. Those differences between people genetically in the sport of weightlifting are so drastic and so vast that the natty and non-natty thing in terms of limits is kind of blown out of the water. Weightlifters trying to increase leg size but worried about fatigue. This is a super interesting question. So obviously when we look at weightlifters, we tend to see the massive, big, juicy quads on them. They'll tend to be very overdeveloped in the quads and in the traps. And then we will counter-reference that and say, I want to be a really good weightlifter, so I want massive, big, juicy quads. In fact, the size of the quad doesn't really matter for a weightlifter. Having the muscle mass there is unbelievably important, but the absolute number of back squat and front squats what really matters the most. So if we're looking at this on a very first principles basis, don't worry about the size of your quads if you're trying to be a weightlifter. Just get your squat numbers up and your quads will grow to the appropriate amount. Now, if you do just want big, thick, juicy quads because you want to look better in skinny jeans, that's absolutely perfect. When we're looking at fatigue and when we're looking at using hypertrophy work in correspondence with or in concurrently with our weightlifting training or any other sports training, what we're really looking at is our taking the bodybuilding thing of maximum recoverable volume, which is the maximum amount of work I can get through those muscle tissues every week and be recovered by the time I get to the next training session. What we're doing is we're using that as a principle, but then making sure it's maximum recoverable volume within the context of me having to be able to perform my sport. So in this case, if I'm looking to do a lot of quad hypertrophy work during my in-season weightlifting program or my actual weightlifting phases of training, I need to look and get as much training volume being done as possible without ever negatively affecting the snatch and clean and jerk sessions. Now, what that might look like is it might look like you're training 4 times per week. You do Monday, Tuesday, rest day Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, rest day Saturday and Sunday. In that case, at the end of our Tuesday session and the end of our Friday session, you can blast your legs as hard as is reasonable. Then you'll have a whole day to recover, a full rest day. And it's very rare that the Thursday session will be impacted or the Monday session will be impacted by that hypertrophy work. But it is just about figuring out that volume. It'll be slightly different for everybody. I would use your snatch work and your clean and jerk work as the main rate limiting factor here. If you find those things are starting to decrease or the quality of those sessions are going down, then just pull back on your hypertrophy work slightly. RTA and pull at the same time.
Yeah, so I'd recommend if you're doing these, I would actually probably run the RTA 1 and Sika pull at the same time. I probably wouldn't be super keen on RTA 2.0 and the RTA and the Sika pull program at the same time, because the squat program peaks after that pulling program, and we don't really want to be peaking your squat 2 weeks after a heavy deadlift. So for running the RTA 1 and the Sika pull program, just 1 point, 2 points. Start them at the same time, start them at the same week, and in the AMRAP week in the pull program, don't go to town. On the first day, go pretty close, but don't go crazy. On the second day, really taper that back. Just use that as a super light day. Do half the number of reps you could possibly do, maybe even a third of the number of reps, and just make sure we're not super fatigued. So push the first AMRAP day in the pull program, second day just give it a bit of a break, and don't absolutely murder yourself on the first AMRAP day. If you get somewhere between over 10 reps, just leave it there.
Give it a rest, will you?
Give it a rest, will you?
Transitioning to powerlifting, would we do it?
No,
it's actually terrible.
I did a powerlifting meet with Dara one time because I forced him to do it.
Yeah, I had to do the powerlifting training cycle. You didn't train at all for it.
I stopped after the squats. I did my 3 squat attempts. I squatted like 270 and I was like, I'm actually not doing the rest of this.
Powerlifting is the reason I no longer do weightlifting. I took a little break from weightlifting after a few years of weightlifting, took a little break, should have taken an off season, but I was convinced by nefarious forces within the company that I should be doing a powerlifting training cycle, and it honestly killed every want inside me to ever pick up a barbell again.
I love coaching powerlifting. I really enjoy coaching powerlifting of everything. I might say
it's definitely one of my favorite things to coach.
Yeah, it's such a controllable block of training. It's such controllable results, inputs and outputs.
I actually really like coaching powerlifters as well.
Yeah.
I feel like powerlifters and manipulating their training, they get it. They work really well towards the goal. I think the style of programming we have for powerlifters, I really enjoy that whole progress. But personally, pour moi is no good.
I think as well, powerlifting programming is actually kind of easy. dare I say, the results are super reliable. Whereas if someone is like, I need to get to the bobsleigh Olympics, you're like, oh no. Every week you're like, okay, is this correct? You know, if someone's coming to you and they're like, I've lost national team funding, or I've lost my pro contract, and you're like, fuck. It's way more stressful. For powerlifting, you can be like, 12 weeks time I think we're going to do this, and by week 10 you're like, I need to change that by 5 kilos. Whereas for everything else you're like,
There's something so pleasing about 4 variables, as in body weight, squat, bench and deadlift.
Yeah.
And they're 4 things. No, I
5 if they're railing gear.
Hey, teaching core bracing to a beginner.
So teaching the core brace is actually something that I think is overly concerned with. Everyone's very good at bracing in my opinion. Now, technical positions are different to bracing, but if you tell someone brace your core, brace your upper body, most people can do this intuitively. It's something you learn. If you watch babies picking up things, if I watch my 2-year-old son and he's bracing like this, trying to pick up one of the plates in the gym, you've learned how to brace. It's very intuitive. So you don't actually need to teach people bracing. You don't need to overcomplicate it. You need to teach hip position, barbell position, back position, hand position, the deadlift, hip height, all of that around bracing. But the actual teaching of the brace is very intuitive. I'll give credit to, I think this was Louis Simmons. He used to do this thing where he'd poke people in the stomach, pretend I'm going to punch you. That's perfect. People talk about bracing in, bracing out, bracing against the belt. It really doesn't matter. It's not something that you actually need to change. And the more complicated you make it, the harder you make it for people. Nice and simple. Tell someone brace. And I have never seen someone brace wrong. All the years we've been coaching people, have you ever seen someone brace something wrong?
That's so rare.
I've
Maybe if they're really breathing up high and they don't, but it's
never,
very rare.
Teaching beginners to brace is just tell them brace, and I guarantee you they will get it right once you correct everything else.
I like the jab in the stomach with a coaching dowel, you know?
Yeah.
Walking around the gym with your coaching stick. I had a rugby coach who used to poke people with a corner flag.
Oh.
Yeah, when they were doing planks. Learning a power clean without a coach. Firstly, can you do it? Yeah, you definitely can. I'm going to give it a shameless plug here for 10 seconds, right? If you're on one of our programs, you get access to the members group. Every week you get to put in videos. Me and Gerf review the videos on a live stream. We post the video in the group and you get your coaching feedback there. There's literally hundreds of people have learned power cleans, snatches without any coach, training in their sheds at home perfectly well with that. When we're looking at a power clean, most of the time you're bringing in a power clean, it's in an S&C setting. So you're using the power clean for a very specific outcome. You want to be more explosive. You want to be better at moving heavy weights fast. In that case, does that power clean have to look absolutely perfect for you to get the benefit? No. If we're coaching you, obviously we want it to be technically perfect. We'll keep giving you that feedback until it is technically perfect. But if you're there and you're 70% of the way to having perfect technique, you're moving through correct positions, you're moving safely between those positions, and those weights and speeds are increasing, you're gonna get most of the gain you're gonna get from it. Will it be a bit nicer? Will it be a bit easier to achieve the top end weights if you have absolutely crispy cream Ilya Ilin technique in your power cleans? Absolutely it will be. But in terms of getting that initial burst of power you're going to get from training something like a power clean, you can certainly do it on your own without a coach. RTA 2.0 and bench program, then add accessory work.
So this question was essentially asking, should they add more assistance work? And the answer to this is probably goal based. So if it's just benching and squatting you care about, then you don't necessarily need to add any more. Probably a big thing you could, or a big option here, is more upper back work. This will actually benefit your bench and squat quite well, but just be cautious of the volume. But if you're running just these two programs, you definitely have room for an extra upper back volume, an extra day of rowing, pulling. I particularly love cable rows if you can do them. Then horizontal rowing, weighted pull-ups are great. I definitely add in some extra back would be the big thing here. Extra core work would never go astray. It's very low fatigue and will probably benefit both of these as well. But the upper back is probably what I'd be covering in this scenario.
Cleans for increasing strength of abduction for Taekwondo. No. So when we're looking at something like those standing kicks in Taekwondo and you want that good level of abduction while also being powerful and fast with that, you might look at the clean and say, okay, you're moving your feet out to the side, you're aggressively extending your hips, maybe that's going to give me something along those lines. In my opinion, that direct skill development should be done as you're kicking and as you're training Taekwondo, not necessarily in the gym. So when we're in the gym, the first thing we're doing is developing that fundamental strength. So our body weight work, our squats, making sure we can go through those ranges of motion, then work on our unilateral work. So being able to stand on our standing legs, fully support our own body weight and manipulate our body around that, and making sure we're strong enough to do that repeatedly over and over again. That not only allows me to be more effective in the kick itself, but it also allows me to go to training. And if I'm doing Taekwondo 4 times per week and hitting a heavy bag or whatever it is, or hitting pads, it will then allow me to be much more consistent in my training sessions, thus increasing the level of efficacy of those training sessions, and then increasing that speed, power, and strength of abduction of the hip. So when we're in the gym, we're really looking to facilitate training, and then when we're doing our training, we're looking for those specific adaptations to occur.
You might not notice, but I have a black belt in Taekwondo.
Oh yeah!
Yeah.
What's they say a word in Taekwondo. Do you know what it is?
Say lots of words, but not sure what one you're referring. Sir, I'm not sure which one you're talking about.
Likes front squats more than back squats, but can't increase. Why?
So this is actually a pretty simple answer, and it's something we've been saying for years ad nauseum, certainly to our weightlifting crowd. Front squats by themselves will not make your front squat very good. Now, of course, doing front squats for a long period of time with enough volume will improve your front squat to a certain degree. But if you want to add big kilos to your front squat, you need to just increase your back squat. I've done it myself. I'm a very good squatter, and I've gone through periods where I've done only front squatting. When my back squat is already strong, I've gone through a period where a couple of years after I squatted 290 in the back squat, I was trying to push my front squat. I was front squatting very regularly. One thing it made me very good at was when I was doing a front squat only training block was really repeatable front squats. So every day I come into the gym, I could hit a perfect 210, but hitting any more, no matter what kind of rep scheme or volume I was doing, wouldn't improve it. Then when I kept my legs strong with back squats and brought them in, then you can bump those numbers up. So for example, when I front squatted 240, my back squat was very strong. I could back squat 240 for 9 reps at the time. So the sad scenario here for you as someone who loves front squatting, you kind of need to push your back squat numbers. You need these heavier torso loaded squat numbers to push up that front squat number. It's just super fatiguing. It's hard to do the requisite volume. Again, you can push it, but you will run into this dead stop if those bigger numbers aren't moving. You could replace it with safety bar squats if you really hate back squats, which would be fine. You want to be getting kind of somewhere between 7 to 10 reps with your goal weight for the front squat to be really safe at front squatting quite well. I'd take 5 to 8 reps if it's a really good quality squat and you're squatting deep as well. Further than that, then you could use machine squats, the pendulum squat or something. They're not just going to have the same transfer. It just won't work. But if you just really, really hate the back squat, my next step would be safety bar squats or similar, maybe camber bar squats if the option. But the back squat number needs to go up for that front squat to ultimately go up.
So this one is, why don't athletes bulk and cut? Do you know what sport this is for?
Just athletes in general.
Just athletes. So athletes not bulking and cutting has 2 assumptions in there. So the first thing is the idea that bulking and cutting is in some way good. And the second thing is that athletes would want to directly manipulate body weight constantly. So bodybuilders are bulking and cutting because more lean tissue mass at relatively or at significantly lower body fat percentages is better for bodybuilding, right? More jacked, more ripped, great for bodybuilding. If you took somebody on the Olympia stage and asked them to run 100 meters, or you asked them to take a few hits in a football game, that's about the worst prepared human being you could possibly be, right? Muscle is great for sport. Muscle is absolutely vital for sport. But there is a trade-off here between being absolutely shredded and being the correct level of body fat for your sport. So hormonal regulation, a small bit of padding, a small bit of ability to fluctuate in our caloric expenditures, ability to recover better, all comes along with having the appropriate level of body fat, and sub 12% body fat is not that. So most of the time, if we're looking for athletic performance, it's going to be somewhere around 15% body fat for males, be a bit higher for females. The second thing is, most athletes want to find an optimal body weight and stay there essentially forever. If you're playing as a winger in soccer, if you're playing as a goalkeeper, if you're a number 7 on the whatever it is, you have a pretty optimal body weight that you basically want to stick at. Now, obviously there are exceptions to this. If you're 350 pounds as a football player, you don't want to be 350 pounds forever. Like, that's really unhealthy, and you might have some fluctuations up and down where you get to drop down and be a bit healthier for a while. But generally speaking, there's an optimal body weight for a particular position in a particular sport, and we mostly get athletes that pretty young in their career and they just stay there forever. So if you want to be 105 kilos as a rugby player, I'm not constantly moving up towards there. Probably in my early 20s I'll get there, and I'll hopefully stick at that body weight for the rest of my career. There might be some tactical changes which at different cases under different managers you want to play a different style of game, which case the pack might gain a bit of weight or they might lose a bit of weight. But generally speaking, athletes want to move into a category or a bracket of body weight and stick there to be the most effective athlete they can possibly be. Training considerations for people in their 30s and 40s.
So if it's just a general recommendation, if we're not looking at any one specific sport, you're probably looking at more extended general physical preparedness periods throughout the year. We find with people in that stage, even if you've been a very good athlete in the past and you've trained a lot, and if for some reason you've dropped off, even in that scenario, if you haven't dropped off, you'll find that you need longer periods of general training before your specific training for whatever your endeavor it is. So whether that be from sport all the way to strength sports, to weightlifting, to powerlifting, you just need longer periods of GPP style training, much more so than you would see younger athletes. Especially as you get into your 40s, you see that becoming much more common. We're looking at non-specific phases, lasting longer than we would see those non-specific phases last as well. It does pay off quite well in the end if you take this period of time. It takes a lot of nuance, takes a little bit of intelligence to apply it correctly and find those right styles of blocks and how long they last. But I would say they're almost mandatory every year for that older athlete in your 40s, regardless of your talent, is that you just need those general physical preparedness phases to prepare yourself for that bigger training block. And I would take them cyclically, take them fairly preemptively, even if you feel like you don't need them. Something's probably going to explode, so I definitely recommend that you take those before that. I find that the rates of injuries and how often old injuries occur in older athletes like this really stave off when we hit those non-specific phases, regardless of the talent of that athlete. Other areas to consider are, of course, goals, what you're training. Nutrition, sleep are all of paramount importance. Mobility is probably the biggest thing. Elasticity of muscles and tendons and joint range of motion, probably the biggest thing to suffer and one of the hardest things to improve upon or get back. You need lots of diligence, and the trend I've seen that if you're new to training in your late 30s or in your 40s, if you haven't really been doing a sport before or a sport that required you to work on mobility, it's hard to really convey from a coaching point of view just how much mobility you actually need to be doing to improve upon your mobility, how long. It's hard enough with younger athletes, it's hard enough with people who need to do it anyway, but when we get to these older athletes, it's something that you really need to be doing. It's one that suffers the most, but to see meaningful changes, how long, how often, how diligent, how frequent you need to be doing it, it's very hard to convince someone who's not used to it. So if you've been, say you're a weightlifter in your 20s and for some reason you dropped off and now you're in 40s, or you didn't drop off, you probably understand how much mobility you need to be doing and you'll probably get on top of it. But if we've athletes who haven't been doing a lot of it, it's a quite interesting note to see that they don't quite grasp just how often, how frequently you need to be doing mobility to see improvements, and how long you need to stay at it to see those improvements, and then how long you need to do it to keep those improvements after.